At 8:58 in the morning on August 1942, Major Paul Pappy Gunn was flying 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea. Not 50 feet above the clouds, not 50 feet above the waves, 50 feet above the water, at full throttle, at 200 miles per hour, in a loaded medium bomber. At that altitude, the ocean doesn't look like water, it looks like concrete. Dead ahead, a Japanese destroyer was turning broadside, its steel hull catching the flat Pacific light. Gunn could see the anti-aircraft barrels swinging downward. The crews had never had to search this low for a target. He could see sailors sprinting across the deck. He could see clearly the windows of the bridge. 1,000 yards, 800. Engineers in California had explained, in neat memos, exactly why what he was about to do was mathematically fatal. Too much forward weight, too much stress on lightweight aluminum. The recoil from the guns would tear the nose off the aircraft like the lid from a tin can. They had done the math, they had the right numbers. They were missing one variable. North of him, in Manila, behind the walls of Santo Tomas internment camp, his wife and 4 children had been surviving for 2 years on starvation rations under Japanese guard. Every convoy that crossed this sea intact made their captivity longer. Every destroyer still afloat was another day they might not survive. The manual didn't account for that. At 600 yards, he wrapped his thumb around the trigger and pressed. The nose didn't just fire, it convulsed. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously, and the aircraft didn't so much shudder as stall, as if the air itself had pushed back. The cockpit filled with a sound that wasn't quite noise anymore. It was pressure. The control column vibrated so violently in Gunn's hands that his vision blurred. For one long second, it felt exactly like the engineers had predicted. Then the structure held. The springs compressed. The cradle absorbed the recoil. The rivets stayed in the aluminum, and ahead of him, a straight, unbroken line of armor-piercing rounds crossed the surface of the destroyer. No arc, no curve, just a flat, brutal geometry of impact. Bridge windows exploded inward. Gun tubs came apart in sparks and smoke. Gunn didn't spray. He walked the stream deliberately, bow to stern, silencing every weapon that could fire back before it had the chance. This wasn't bombing. It was something closer to surgery. Performed at 200 miles per hour, 50 feet above the ocean, but to understand how a 43-year-old officer ended up here, flying a medium bomber like a fighter, ignoring every manual ever written about how to use one. You have to understand how badly the war was going. American air doctrine in the Pacific had been built on a single promise: precision. Bombers at 20,000 feet, releasing ordnance with mathematical accuracy, placing explosives into targets the size of a pickle barrel. It sounded convincing in Washington briefings. Against moving ships on open water, it was fiction. A bomb dropped from 20,000 feet takes nearly 40 seconds to fall. 40 seconds for a destroyer captain to read the drop, spin the wheel, and simply not be there when the payload arrived. Against maneuvering convoys, the hit rate was below 1%. Fuel burned. Bombs splashed harmlessly into open water. And the Japanese convoys, the Tokyo Express running troops and supplies down to New Guinea, almost untouched, kept coming. If they secured enough airfields in New Guinea, northern Australia would fall within range of sustained attack. On paper, American air power looked overwhelming. In the field, it was missing. General George Kinney, commanding Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was not a man interested in elegant theory. He needed ships on the bottom of the ocean. The only aircraft he had in numbers was the North American B-25 Mitchell, sturdy, dependable, and built for exactly the wrong kind of war. It had a glazed bombardier's nose, a precision sight, and a doctrine that pointed it toward altitude and away from risk. Gunn looked at it differently. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, he escaped by air. His wife Polly and their 4 children did not. They were taken to Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where disease and starvation ground people down as steadily as any weapon. Gunn knew what was happening inside those walls. He knew every resupply convoy that got through extended it. Every Japanese transport that reached New Guinea meant more soldiers, more airfields, more months before the war moved back toward Manila. He wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about the calendar. His proposal was simple enough to sound absurd. Strip the bombardier's position entirely. Remove the glass nose. Replace it with welded steel plate. Mount fixed forward-firing heavy machine guns. Not for defense, but for attack. Transform a medium bomber into something that flew toward the enemy instead of over it. The engineers heard him out. Then they explained carefully why it was impossible. They calculated the recoil force of a single Browning M2. Then they multiplied by 4. Then by 8. The forward fuselage wasn't built for that stress. Firing all guns simultaneously would tear it apart. The added weight would shift the center of gravity too far forward, making the aircraft nearly impossible to rotate on takeoff, and potentially uncontrollable once airborne. Even if the frame somehow survived, the vibration would shatter the plexiglass canopy and blind the pilot before the first burst ended. On paper, they were right about everything. Gunn read the memos. Then he went to find scrap metal. In the maintenance yards outside Brisbane, he built what the factories wouldn't. Instead of rigid mounts, which would transfer every ounce of recoil directly into the airframe, he constructed a floating cradle, suspended on springs and shock absorbers scavenged from junked vehicles. When the guns fired, the assembly would recoil backward into the springs, bleeding off energy before it could reach the aircraft's skin. It wasn't a clean solution. It looked improvised because it was improvised, but the principle was sound. The morning he taxied the modified Mitchell to the runway, the mechanics watched in silence. The aircraft sat nose heavy, its steel-plated front end pointing slightly downward, looking less like a warplane than like something assembled under deadline. Gunn flew alone. Not for heroism. If the nose tore off at 2,000 feet, there was no reason to take anyone else with it. The takeoff roll stretched longer than normal. The end of the runway came up fast. For a moment, the weight in the nose seemed to win, the aircraft refusing to rotate, committed to the ground. Then Gunn pulled back hard, and the Mitchell climbed, barely clearing the tree line at the far end of the field. Over open water, he leveled off and armed the guns. He pressed the trigger. The aircraft shuddered violently. Airspeed bled away as if someone had thrown out an anchor. The roar inside the cockpit was total. A sustained industrial hammering that lasted exactly as long as he held the trigger and stopped exactly when he released it. But the structure held. The springs compressed and expanded. The tracers converged into a tight, disciplined stream 1,000 yards ahead, drilling into the ocean in a focused cone. The recoil system worked. He landed, climbed out, and walked around the nose. The steel plate was scorched. The spring mounts had shifted slightly under load. Everything else was intact. He went back inside to write down what needed adjusting, because the guns were only half the problem. He still needed a way to deliver bombs from 50 feet above the water without killing the pilots dropping them. Building the gunship solved only half of Gunn's equation. Machine guns could silence a deck, shred gun crews, and tear open exposed steel, but they couldn't reliably sink a loaded transport. For that, you still needed bombs, and dropping a 500-pound bomb from 50 feet above the ocean was almost suicidal. At that altitude, the explosion could tear your own aircraft apart before you had time to escape. Traditional bombing doctrine offered no solution. The manuals simply didn't account for pilots flying at mast height. So Gunn reached back to something far older than military theory. Skip bombing wasn't new. It was physics children understood at the edge of a pond. Throw a stone too steep and it sinks. Throw it flat, hard, and parallel to the surface. It skips. Gunn wanted to do the same thing with half a ton of high explosive. To make it work, the aircraft had to approach at roughly 200 miles per hour, level with the horizon, no higher than 50 feet. Release too early, and the bomb would plunge harmlessly into the sea. Release too late, and the splash could damage your own tail assembly. The margin for error was measured in fractions of seconds. Even if the skip succeeded, the blast radius of a 500-pound bomb was lethal, well beyond the altitude of the attacking plane. The solution was brutally simple: a delayed fuse, 4 to 5 seconds. Just enough time for the bomb to strike the water, skip into the hull of a ship at the waterline, sink slightly, and detonate beneath the surface, where the shock wave would do the most damage. Training was unforgiving. Off the coast, near Port Moresby, sat the rusting wreck of the SS Pruth, half submerged and abandoned. Gunn turned it into a target. Crews made run after run at wave-top height, engines screaming, palms sweating on throttles. Every instinct drilled into them during flight school told them to climb. Altitude meant survival. Here, survival demanded the opposite: lower, faster, closer. If they weren't feeling prop wash disturb the ocean's surface, they were too high. And this was where the forward guns changed everything. In a traditional bombing run, the attacking aircraft was exposed, flying straight toward concentrated anti-aircraft fire. But the modified B-25 wasn't approaching quietly. 2 miles out, pilots opened fire. Long streams of .50 caliber rounds tore across the deck of the target ship, suppressing gun crews before they could even aim. The bomber was no longer a passive delivery vehicle. It was both sledgehammer and shield. By the time the pilot reached bomb release distance, the ship was already fighting for survival. General George Guinea saw the results and made a decision that would alter the campaign in the Pacific. Every available B-25 in theater would be modified. There was no time to ship them back to factories. The conversions happened in open-air workshops under tropical rain. Mechanics working through mud and malaria, cutting away glass noses, welding steel plates, mounting gun cradles modeled after Gunn's improvised design. The aircraft that emerged were mismatched, scarred, and heavy, but they were predators. By late February 1943, a squadron of these hybrid Strafers stood ready. The pilots who flew them had changed too. They no longer saw themselves as high-altitude bus drivers releasing bombs from a safe remove. They were hunters trained to close distance, to stare directly at the bridge of an enemy ship before firing. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Intelligence reports began filtering in from coast watchers and code breakers. A major Japanese convoy had assembled at Rabaul. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers as escort. Thousands of soldiers bound for New Guinea. If they landed successfully, Allied positions at Lae and Salamaua would be overwhelmed. The Japanese believed weather would protect them. A tropical system rolling through the Solomon Sea, low cloud cover grounding high-altitude bombers. They were right about one thing: traditional bombing would struggle in those conditions. They were wrong about everything else. On March 1st, a patrolling B-24 spotted the convoy through a break in the storm. Coordinates were transmitted, speed calculated, course plotted. The convoy was entering the Bismarck Sea. Guinea studied the map, then looked at Gunn. Welding torches were cold now. Training was complete. The theory of recoil springs and skip bombs would face 16 warships and thousands of armed men. There would be no controlled test environment this time. On the morning of March 3rd, the clouds began to lift. The sea lay gray and deceptively calm. The Japanese convoy advanced in tight formation, destroyers circling the transports, guns trained upward, scanning the sky for bombers at 20,000 feet. They were looking in the wrong direction. At 10 a.m., dark shapes appeared on the horizon. Not high, distant specks, but aircraft hugging the ocean's surface. Australian fighters came first, cannons blazing, strafing decks, and forcing gunners to dive for cover. Behind them, in disciplined formation, came the B-25s. Inside the lead aircraft, the pilot aligned his nose with the destroyer Horatio. At mast height, the massive warship looked less like a target and more like a wall of steel rising from the sea. At this range, a destroyer should have dominated the fight. Its 5-inch guns could obliterate an aircraft miles away, but those guns could not depress low enough to engage an attacker skimming the surface at 10 feet above the water. The pilot flipped the arming switch. He pressed the trigger. The nose erupted again in controlled violence. The recoil system slammed backward against its springs, the entire aircraft shuddering as though struck. Tracers stitched across the destroyer's bridge. Gun crews fell before they could fire. Steel plating sparked and peeled. The B-25 did not veer away. It kept coming. At 300 yards, the pilot released his bomb. It struck the water flat, skipped once, twice, then slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The fuse ticked silently beneath the surface. The bomber roared overhead, engines straining as the pilot pulled up. Then the explosion came. Not upward in a plume, but inward, tearing open the side of the ship below the armor belt. Water rushed in. The hull fractured. A 2,000-ton warship began to die. And across the convoy, the same scene unfolded again and again. What followed was not a chaotic dogfight. It was methodical dismantling. Once the first destroyer was crippled, the defensive formation unraveled. The escorts tried to maneuver, but tight convoy spacing became a liability. Every turn exposed a broadside. Every evasive zigzag slowed the transports they were meant to protect. And speed meant nothing against aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour with complete freedom of direction. The B-25s circled and reformed. They did not climb away. They came back low, using the smoke and confusion as cover. Each run began the same way, guns first. Long, sustained bursts of .50 caliber fire swept across decks, bridges, and gun tubs. Anti-aircraft crews attempting to reman their stations were cut down almost immediately. The suppression worked exactly as Gunn had envisioned. A ship cannot fight if its gunners cannot stand. Then came the bombs. 500-pound explosives skipped across the surface of the sea like thrown stones, striking hulls at the most vulnerable point, the waterline. Unlike high-altitude drops that relied on gravity and hope, these were aimed strikes. Pilots could see the rivets in the plating before release. They could see faces on the bridge. One transport erupted in flames when its aviation fuel ignited. Another suffered a catastrophic detonation below deck as munitions stores exploded internally. The blasts were not dramatic. Hollywood fireballs rising into the sky. They were concussive, structural failures that split hulls open and forced seawater into engine rooms within seconds. The destroyer Asashio burned from bow to stern. Takitsukaze drifted crippled, smoke pouring from shattered superstructure. Transports that had carried thousands of troops only hours earlier began listing heavily. Decks crowded with men scrambling toward lifeboats that would never clear the oil-slicked water. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. Where a disciplined invasion convoy had advanced that morning, there was now debris, flame, and spreading black oil. The water was littered with wreckage and survivors clinging to planks. The B-25 crews, low on bombs but not ammunition, continued strafing runs against vessels still afloat. The objective was absolute denial. No reinforcement, no recovery, no regrouping. Brutal efficiency replaced spectacle. This was industrial warfare compressed into a single morning, and the numbers reflected it. 8 troop transports destroyed. 4 destroyers sunk outright. others crippled beyond operational use. Thousands of Japanese troops lost before ever reaching shore. The Tokyo Express, the high-speed reinforcement lifeline that had sustained Japanese expansion in New Guinea, effectively ceased to function after that day. American losses were minimal by comparison. Aircraft returned scarred, wings punctured, paint blistered from passing through fireballs, landing gear bent from flying too close to sinking ships. But they returned. Ground crews counted them as they came in, expecting gaps in formation that never appeared. In the debriefing tents, reports accumulated rapidly. Damage assessments confirmed what pilots had witnessed at wave-top height. Bombs had detonated below the waterline. Decks had been swept clear before release. The signature was unmistakable. This was not high-altitude theory. This was Gunn's method. In a single engagement, the balance of air-sea warfare in the Southwest Pacific shifted. The Japanese command had prepared for strategic bombing from the stratosphere. They had not prepared for medium bombers attacking like torpedo boats with wings. The official manuals had described low-level attacks as reckless. The Bismarck Sea proved they were decisive. Back in Australia and the United States, the skepticism evaporated. Engineers who had once circulated memoranda predicting structural failure now examined combat photographs showing intact aircraft and destroyed ships. Factory lines began incorporating solid noses and forward-firing gun packages directly into production models. What had started as an unauthorized field modification became standard configuration. The suicide concept had become doctrine. And yet for Gunn, the victory was incomplete, because north of that battlefield, in Manila, the gates of Santo Tomas were still closed. For the newspapers, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a triumph of air power. For strategists, it was proof that low-level attack doctrine worked. For engineers, it was a lesson in humility. For Gunn, it was progress, but not closure. His family was still inside Santo Tomas. Destroying convoys bought time. It strangled reinforcement routes. It shifted the balance in New Guinea. But it did not unlock prison gates. And so, instead of easing off after Bismarck, Gunn pushed further. If 8 forward-firing .50 calibers could tear apart destroyers, he wondered what something heavier could do. He began experimenting again, this time with a 75mm cannon, a field artillery piece designed to be fired from the ground. Mounting it in the nose of a B-25 sounded even more absurd than the recoil spring system had months earlier. The weapon weighed hundreds of pounds. Its recoil was violent enough to jolt a vehicle backward. Fired in the air, it felt as if the entire aircraft momentarily paused in the sky. But once again, he made it function. The modified gunships became flying tank destroyers, capable of firing a single shell that could punch deep into a ship's structure from miles away. They were not elegant machines. They were instruments built around necessity and urgency. Every modification was driven by one calculation: end the war faster. In late 1944, as American forces moved back toward the Philippines, Gunn flew missions over territory that had once been home. The campaign was relentless. Anti-aircraft fire was heavier. Japanese resistance was desperate. Then, during one mission, his luck ran thin. His aircraft was hit. It went down in the jungle. He survived the crash, but not untouched. White phosphorus burns tore into his skin. His hand was mangled. He lost a finger. Surgeons looked at the damage and did what logic demanded. They grounded him permanently. A 45-year-old officer with severe burns and a crippled hand had no business flying combat missions. Gunn ignored that verdict the same way he had ignored engineering reports 2 years earlier. He found ways back into the air. Supply runs, reconnaissance, anything that kept him close to the fight, because now the war was moving toward Manila. On February 3rd, 1945, American forces broke through the gates of Santo Tomas. Inside were thousands of civilians reduced to near starvation. Skeletal, exhausted, surviving on rations barely sufficient to stay alive. Among them were Paul Gunn and their 4 children. They had endured 3 years of captivity, disease, malnutrition, uncertainty. When Gunn finally walked into that camp, he was no longer the architect of the Strafer or the officer who rewrote low-level attack doctrine. He was a husband and a father who had spent 3 years building machines violent enough to bring the war closer to its end. And this time, the manual didn't matter. His family was alive. After the war, he was offered advancement, staff roles, promotions, a place within the peacetime military structure. He declined. He had no interest in bureaucracy or in teaching doctrine from behind a desk. He remained in the Philippines, returning to civilian aviation, founding a small airline, and flying routes over jungles and islands he knew better than most maps did. But men who live their lives in the cockpit rarely fade quietly. On January 16, 1957, flying a Beechcraft Bonanza through bad weather near Manila, Gunn encountered conditions no amount of improvisation could overcome. The aircraft went down. He was 57 years old. He had survived anti-aircraft fire, crash landings, burns, and a global war. In the end, it was weather, not enemy gunfire, that ended his story. His legacy, however, never left the sky. Every aircraft built around the idea that firepower can be concentrated forward, every gunship designed to suppress before it strikes, traces a lineage back to those muddy workshops in Australia. The principle that air power must adapt to the battlefield rather than wait for perfect conditions became embedded in doctrine. But strip away the strategy, the production lines, the after-action reports, and the story becomes simpler. A man looked at a problem everyone said was impossible. He built a solution out of scrap metal, and he did it because somewhere, beyond the horizon, his children were waiting.